So it will be a nice opportunity again for you to reunite with your field. Judah is going to speak about the American period in Idelsohn life, and with a special address to the book Jewish Music and Historical Theory. Judah, bevakasha.
We know that we moved into the 21st century when there is no podium here but a screen. So I'll do my best to read this one. I wish I were 10 years older so that I could be farsighted. In any case, I want to also make sure to thank Edwin, Naomi, and everyone involved with this track within the World Congress, as well as Jim and Noah. We, I feel, have been able to put together a very interesting session, and I hope that my paper will be able to add to that. In 1929, Avram Tzvi Idelsohn published his major narrative work, Jewish Music in its Historical Development, marking a watershed moment for the theoretical and discursive basis of Jewish music. Viewed today as a classic work in its field, Idelsohn's book merged wide-ranging textual, ethnographic, and musicological research to establish a clear sonic Jewish heritage with its own continuous and durable grand narrative. The book's broad publicity and scholarly attention, moreover, helped solidify a reimagining of Jewish music for both musical practice and future research. At the same time, I argue here that Idelsohn's Idelsohn's book, Jewish Music, and I'll refer to it that way, not the general idea, also reflected a specific agenda that resonated with his recent rise to authority in American Reform Judaism. This situation, though short-lived, became embedded in a book many credit today with the founding of Jewish musicology. From Palestine to America. Idelsohn's ideological shift from Hebrew music, as Jim has been able to beautifully present, as he promoted in the issue, to Jewish music in America overlapped with the prolonged production process of his own publications and led to a kind of diglossia that addressed sonic issues in two contrasting Jewish populations. At the time of his arrival in the United States, in late 1922, he had written, but not yet published, the first volume of his three-volume history of the Hebrew melody, Toldot Hanigidah Ha'ivri, which was published in 1924, and he had also published volumes 1 through 4 of his Hebräische Orientalische Melodieschatz, the source that he was that Jim was talking about. They were either published or just being published. These major works continued his attempts to reframe the concept of Hebrew music in the Yishuv to culminate in the founding of a culturally centered Jewish state. Despite his pleas to Jewish organizations around the globe for additional resources, however, he had been unable to raise the funds he needed to bring the remainder of his Hebrew music research into a permanent form. Consequently, Idelsohn redirected his efforts to appeal to concerns of the diaspora, where he felt he had a better chance for institutional support. From the Zionistic plans of Jerusalem, therefore, Idelsohn's focus and intellectual projects eventually shifted to the concerns of communal self-preservation among European and ultimately American Jews, and both of these works reflect that. On November 15, 1922, after spending several months in Europe, Idelsohn arrived in New York and quickly took a cantorial position at Mordechai Kaplan's recently established Society for the Advancement of Judaism, as Noah has brought up. A well-received talk at the 1923 meeting of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, however, led Idelsohn to leave Kaplan's synagogue and go on a national lecture tour. Promoted by the Reform movement, Idelsohn's subsequent lectures seemed a breath of fresh air for the populations he addressed, at least as far as they were described, and they charted an exciting future for American Jewish music. His tour, in turn, essentially ended with an appointment at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. First, as an assistant to the library, that was his official title, hired to help catalog the recently acquired Birnbaum collection, then as temporary professor of Jewish liturgy and music in his second year. In the third year, on September 1st, 1925, the college's board appointed Idelsohn to, quote, full professor of Jewish liturgy and music, making him the only tenured professor of music, let alone Jewish music, in the country. Now, at the end of September 1927, a representative from the publisher Henry Holt phoned Joshua Block, a Judaica librarian at the New York Public Library, for recommendations on an author for a potential volume on Jewish music. Block, who knew Idelsohn's scholarship and likely worked with him during his brief stay in New York, immediately mentioned Idelsohn's name. By the end of the year, under Bloch's mediation, Idelsohn and Holt had come to amicable terms for a 140 to 160,000 word book with numerous musical examples. Wouldn't we have such things today? Or maybe we should. 7 months later, in July 1928, Idelsohn sent off the final draft for what would become Jewish music in its historical development. The book retained many similarities to Idelsohn's history of Hebrew music, though with important changes in emphasis. The first volume of Toldot Hanigina from 1924 largely comprised a clinic in documenting and classifying chant melodies under the explicit hope that readers would learn to recognize the basic components of Hebrew music in the same way the ancient Hebrews knew them in pre-exilic times. Jewish music in its historical development, in contrast, provided an entirely different program. Rather than trying to revive an ancient national melos, Idelsohn aimed to frame the musical practices of Jews in various lands and cultures, quote, as a tonal expression of Judaism and of Jewish life. And here it'll be interesting to see the parallels between Jim's paper and my own. Thus, what in 1924 was a meticulous presentation of 20 different cantillation and modal systems became in 1929 a speedy 4-chapter progression through the chants of the great ancient civilizations, ending with a survey of Jewish biblical chant. These 4 chapters included truncated versions of many of Toldot Hanigina's musical examples. Yet specifically, the English work omitted musical excerpts from less iconic Jewish communities, including from Bukhara, Syria, Morocco, Gibraltar, southern France, the Balkans, and Italy, in favor of a rough 5-part comparison. Yemenite, quote, Sephardic Oriental, Sephardic European, these are his terms, Ashkenazic, and Christian Catholic. Given Idelsohn's focus on Hebrew Oriental melodies prior to his arrival in the United States, his choice to cut many such sources for his major English language history may well have hinged on the needs of his readership. In America, he no longer actively tried to build a musical culture from Middle Eastern soil, and thus he used a more general evocation of the East en route to an American-focused narrative. The centrality of America factored heavily into other aspects of the work. Excepting 2 chapters, numbers 7 and 17, that focused on Arabic and Sephardic musical forms, the remainder of the 1929 book tracked the historical trajectory of Jewish music through Central and Eastern Europe and toward the United States. By forging this narrative, which foreshadowed the publication of his thesaurus's final volumes, all on Ashkenazic Jewry, and most taken from sources associated with his European and largely also Hebrew Union College-based documentary work, Idelsohn linked contemporary American Jews to a musical heritage that distilled, quote, original elements and features reflecting the spiritual life of the Jewish people, end quote, and prescribed means for Jews to highlight those elements in their synagogue music as part of the march of Western civilization, with America at the apex. Idelsohn's intellectual project, removed from Palestine's nationalist crucible, also came to emphasize the role of Reform Judaism in his new vision of Jewish music. Whereas in the Yeshuv, Idelsohn had set out to illustrate the Oriental essence of Jewish music as a basis for its renaissance, by 1929 he had shifted his discussion to place particular emphasis on the music leading up to and following from 19th century religious reform. 2 central chapters of the book, numbers 12 and 13 out of 23 chapters, were devoted exclusively to Reform Judaism. And in these chapters, Idelsohn offered his own philosophy of Reform Judaism's potential to further the cause of Jewish music. He harshly criticized what he called radical reformers of the 19th century, such as Israel Jacobson, who he saw as recklessly introducing Christian musical forms into Jewish worship, mainly for aesthetic purposes. Quote, without radical reform attempts, he noted, the synagogue would have felt the change of taste and would have immediately produced songs in the classic style, but also in accord with the Jewish traditional genius of synagogue song. But with the abolition of the entire Jewish song,